Welcome, everyone. Come on in. We had quite a few RSVPs for today, so we'll wait a few minutes for people to sign on here. All right. $7:03, so we'll get started around 7:05, everyone. So hang tight if you need to get a glass of water or refreshment. Now's the time. Everyone has a little. Okay, I see some familiar faces and some new faces, so that is tremendous. We've got some other counselors on the call and counselors teams, which is great. So welcome everyone. Welcome to my colleagues, my college ward, friends. Okay, so we'll get started. Can I just have a wave if I can be heard and that my volume's okay? Okay, that's great. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Merci à tous et à tous pour nous joindre ce soir. Je m'appelle Laine Johnson. Je suis la conseillère pour la Quartier Collège here in College Ward. And I'm so pleased that you found some time to join us as we discuss the construction of affordable housing. So firstly, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And certainly when we're talking about building on land, you know, this acknowledgement becomes increasingly important. And I know that the City of Ottawa and CAHDCO both are working, you know, to examine their own practices when it comes to reconciliation through land. And so we must ensure that we keep that in our mind, that this is unceded and unsurrendered land. And then the other thing that's really coming up for me today is that despite it being an absolutely beautiful day, we have been notified that there will be a potentially very significant weather event tonight leading into tomorrow, where we may see accumulation of 10 to 15 millimeters of ice. And so we are about to enter into what could be, I'm seeing that I might be the first person to let some of our guests know this, so I don't mean to cause concern, but we have people in our city that have nowhere to go tonight. You know, we have people in our city who are trying to figure out how to find shelter. And when we have extreme weather events like this, it just becomes even more real when we have a safe place to be cozy, how fortunate we are and how we must be working ever tirelessly to correct for this housing crisis that we are in. So despite us, you know, having gone through both provincial and federal funding announcements over the last week, today we are focused on the City of Ottawa to begin. And the City of Ottawa, you know, recently passed its budget on March 1st. And I put forward a motion that was unanimously supported to allocate an increase of an additional $1 million into affordable housing capital construction. And it was the biggest move of money in that budget once it was set. And a lot of people after that were saying, okay, so $1 million more for affordable housing construction, like big deal. You know, what's $1 million going to do? What are we going to be able to achieve with $1 million? And I thought that was, you know, a fair reaction. Then we had other people who were asking, well, you know, what can $1 million do? And there was some conversation about, well, it can help us when we're financing. Oh, do we have to borrow in order to build affordable housing? Are we going to create debt based on affordable housing? Do we need to be worried about debt? And I realized, you know, that this is a great moment for some education about how affordable housing gets built, how financing is actually very much part of the equation for our nonprofit housing providers. And so I welcomed my old colleague and dear friend, Graham Hussey from CAHDCO, who is the leading affordable housing development consultant here in the city of Ottawa, but they are also working through some national granting bodies to support nonprofit housing providers across the country to develop their own little CAHDCOs, because what they are doing to support nonprofit actors in the city to transform their assets, their land, or their equity into affordable housing for their communities can be replicated and scalable. So Graham is leading that effort nationally, and we are so lucky to have him here in the city of Ottawa. So welcome, Graham. And we also have Lauren Reeves, who has recently served as our interim director of housing services. And Lauren has the details, which I know people are really excited about. So did you know that when we are talking about $15 million for affordable housing, we actually already know where most of it is going? The city of Ottawa has a long-range financial plan for housing. So we know how many units are coming forward, what they need, and we know that the need is ever growing and our waiting list is ever larger. And so Lauren will be able to not only detail what's in the pipeline for the city of Ottawa, but help us to understand what those provincial and federal funds can do and what they cannot do for the city of Ottawa to realize its affordable housing goals. And so we will be able to learn from Lauren tonight what we still need to do and what our ambitions are for the city of Ottawa to really get our butts in gear when it comes to building new affordable housing for the city of Ottawa, and how to support those nonprofit actors who are already busting their bums to get this done. How we create an enabling environment for more to be built faster. What do we need to do? And so I'm so grateful to the two of you for coming tonight and sharing. It's a jam-packed, you ask two big thinkers about this and you get two enormous slide decks. So watch out, get your notepads out, get your pencils out. What we're going to do for questions is we're going to ask you to put them in the chat as we're going, okay? And Heather, fabulous Heather, can't move on without giving a shout out to Heather Perot, my tremendous staff person who has come together, brought us together. Thank you so much, Heather. Heather's going to work to synthesize those questions into maybe some, you know, bigger questions or fewer questions if there's some repeated, so that we can be sure to get our questions out towards the end, okay? So please use the chat. And we'll try and be able to answer most questions. And if you find that you still have questions after this, you don't hesitate to get in touch with my office at all. Okay, we would be happy to point you in the right direction, or if we need to do another meeting about something else that just really tickles your fancy, we'd be more than happy to do that. Okay, so I really, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today, and very much a shout out to my other council colleagues who have joined for their information today. So without any further ado, Heather is going to support Graham for his slide presentation. Heather, did I forget anything?
No,
she's gone.
No, I'm not gone. I'm just sneaking away. So we're going to record the meeting.
Oh, thank you.
And so if you don't want to be on the video, I don't think most would, because it's going to be, there's going to be the slide deck, but feel free to turn your cameras off. And then, yeah, we're gonna start with Lauren and then go to Graham, and I'm gonna do the slides for them. So you should be able to see their faces while they're speaking.
All right, thank you so much. And Graham, whenever you're ready, and if you just want to wave to the group so that they know who you are before the slides go up, that would be great.
Laine, I think Lauren's going first.
Oh, switcheroo. There you go. Lauren's going first. All right. So Lauren, my apologies. If you want to wave, there she is. Hi, everybody. Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
Okay, I'll stop
Hi.
talking.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor. Thank you for the opportunity. I'll just introduce myself again. I'm Lauren Reeves. I'm actually the manager of the Affordable Housing Development Unit, and our director is also fortunately here. So Paul Levine is the Director of Housing Services, and I believe he's in attendance. There he is. Hi, Paul. Give a wave. So if I need to defer any future questions to the director, I'm glad to know you're here, Paul. So thanks for also attending. Okay, so tonight I'm going to present the city's strategy for investing in and delivering affordable housing projects. Next slide, please. I'll speak about the 10-year housing and homelessness plan, which sets our long-term goals. Then I'll speak to you about the long-range financial plan for housing that establishes how we can financially meet those goals. I'll describe the various funding envelopes that we have access to through the federal and provincial governments. And then I'll speak about the city's Action Ottawa program and the incentives it provides in addition to capital funding. I'll give a bit of an update on the affordable housing that's underway and the key funding opportunities and pressures we're facing in the near term for delivery of new units. And then finally, I'll summarize with some key takeaways. Next slide, please. So the work that we do in housing services is guided by our 10-year housing and homelessness plan, and some of our key targets over the 10-year term from 2020 to 2030 include reducing overall homelessness by 25%, reducing chronic homelessness entirely, eliminating unsheltered homelessness, preserving the existing affordable housing supply, and what we're focusing on today, increasing the supply of affordable housing by creating between 5,700 and 8,500 units or housing benefits. So that's overall over the 10-year period. So of that, we target delivery of about 500 new affordable housing units per year under this plan. So keep in mind that that's our target, 500 units a year. Thanks. So what is affordable housing? It's rental housing built since 2001 that provides affordable housing with ongoing operating subsidy. So it's not public housing or social housing that was built, 40 years ago under the Housing Services Act. It's new affordable housing developments which are provided in mixed income communities with a range of building types, tenant profiles, and levels of support. Rents here are typically set at 80% of the average market rent, and we take that from CMHC's annual market rent. It is created by providing capital funding for the construction of housing with a not-for-profit partner typically, in exchange for a commitment that the housing will be offered at a rent that is below the average market rent for a period of time, and that's usually 20 to 50 years. Supportive housing is also affordable housing, so we build the bricks and mortar of both affordable and supportive housing with our capital funding. And that is a community-based, person-centered model of providing permanent accommodation that provides a range of supports and services, and it's based on the individual's needs. Rents are lower. They're at Ontario Works or ODSP levels, and these supportive housing providers also rely on some operating funding. So fundamental to our investment approach then is that we deliver the bricks and mortar and the projects that provide deeper affordability will receive greater incentives and more funding. So next slide, please. So the long-range financial plan for housing establishes the amount of funding required to deliver on the objectives of the 10-year plan, and it also sets out how the city will pay for those investments. So in March of 2021, Council approved the city's first long-range financial plan for housing and agreed to increase the city's annual contribution toward affordable housing to $20 million per year over the 10-year period. This amount includes $15 million for capital funding, in addition to $5 million in annual development charge exemptions and fee waivers. So the LRFP is based on the city's $20 million in funding being matched by both the province and the federal government. So it's a $600 million plan over the 10-year term. So in order to realize up to 500 new units constructed each year, capital funding is allocated to generally our not-for-profit housing providers, and it's bundled with development charge relief and fee waivers, along with then the housing provider would take that equity in the form of the capital contribution, the additional fee waivers, and they would apply to CMHC, typically their co-investment financing program. They would apply to them for favorable interest rates to finance their project. So we're not currently able to deliver that 500 unit target. There is a lack of matching funding from the other levels of government. And as you're all aware, there's been a substantial increase in construction costs over the last few years, and more recently, an increase in financing rates, such that where the LRFP, as we call it, the Long Range Financial Plan, the LRFP assumed that $60 million per year between the three levels of government, would be a sufficient subsidy to deliver 500 affordable units. That required subsidy is now nearly doubled, and it's closer to 100 million per year. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot of the capital funding that we've received over the last few years. Both the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario provide capital funding for the delivery of affordable housing. These funding allocations come with rules on how funds can be spent and are typically issued on a use it or lose it basis. The funding is allocated to not-for-profit housing providers to subsidize the construction costs and therefore to permit the organization to deliver units at lower rents. The city's $15 million in capital does not go as far as it did years ago, as I was saying, due to increased construction and financing costs. So construction costs have nearly doubled, such that the cost to deliver a unit is now $400,000 to $600,000 per unit for an affordable unit. That's what it costed to construct it. And the subsidy that was expected to be required for that in 2021 was about $120,000 is what we would, on average, put toward a unit. Now the subsidy required per unit is at around $200,000. The other thing is, so where we're talking about leveraging, providing 120 to 200,000 for a unit, we're looking at, 30 to 50% of the equity for a unit is what we would typically be able to provide. But you look at the federal Rapid Housing Initiative funding of $72.8 million, but in terms of the rules around that program, it didn't allow us, or it doesn't allow us, to leverage that funding as much. So that program, for example, requires that construction be covered 100%. So there is no financing permitted if you're using Rapid Housing Initiative funding. So next slide, please. So just as as an example, the program requirements: eligible projects target individuals who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, so they are on OW or ODSP supports, so rents are very, very low. CMHC specifies the minimum number of units that must be delivered. In the last round, we received $18.5 million just this year from RHI, and we're required to deliver 48 units. So we're looking at about 380,000 per unit is what CMHC provided to us. So there is a bit of a delta, a gap that the city would have to fund in order to deliver the 48 units. Rounds 1 and 2 required a 12-month delivery, and round 3, they've learned that tough to deliver inside of 12 months, so they've extended the construction period to 18 months. Now, the majority of our round 1 and 2 projects have experienced delays and significant cost increases, such that in 2022, our capital plan allocated $13.3 million just in contingency funding to the projects that were already underway and at risk. So we received council approval to allocate that amount of money to existing projects, primarily the RHI projects. And now in 2023, we'll be taking our capital plan to Planning and Housing Committee in June of this year. And again, we'll be recommending that some funds be allocated for additional contingency for projects that are running over budget again. Next slide, please. I was asked to give a little bit of background on the Federal Housing Accelerator Fund that was just announced last month. This is a $4 billion national fund to increase housing supply for a 3-year period, 2023 to 2026. And it's application based, so it is not guaranteed funding for any municipality. There is, however, a team of planners and those of us in housing services working on putting together an application for this funding. It's based on creating an action plan that shows how the municipality would increase supply overall. And on the basis of, you get funding, if you're successful, you get funding on the basis of a per unit increase in building permits for the 3-year period. So the maximum funding you could get is $54,000 for additional units over your otherwise expected growth. So you have to increase your growth rate through these new actions. Anyway, there is a bonus of $19,000 to deliver affordable units. So of the 54,000, 19,000 would be if you deliver affordable units. So they are incentivizing delivery of affordable units through this. If we're successful in receiving funding, it is provided in installments, and then municipalities can use the funds for a variety of things, including, for example, infrastructure, environmental initiatives, and you can use it for construction of affordable housing. But it's not geared specifically to affordable housing. It's geared to increase supply. So applications will be accepted only during the first 2 weeks of June. So this is a bit of a key focus for us at the moment. Next slide, please. We do receive some provincial funding annually under the Ontario Priorities Housing Initiative. We're receiving $5.9 million this year. The province has let us know that we'll receive $5.7 million next year, but we're not aware of any future funding at this point. So it's difficult to plan longer term without knowing what sort of funding we'll get from the province. This OFI program, it also funds this Ontario Renovates program. It's a very successful program that we've run for many years. It provides smaller forgivable loans for accessibility modifications and repairs to low-income homeowners and private landlords, as well as not-for-profit housing providers. So the city does continue to advocate for reliable and equivalent contributions for funding for capital planning purposes to the province. Next slide, please. So I pointed out the need for additional capital funding, but this slide is to point out that there are other initiatives that we have implemented or are working on that can increase affordability or the supply of affordable housing. So we have the Interdepartmental Task Force on Affordable Housing, and this is a team of reps from across the city who are looking at the city's portfolio of vacant land along the LRT lines and how we might leverage those lands with the private sector and the not-for-profit sector to deliver affordable units. There is the existing affordable land and funding policy, which requires that when any city land is sold, 25% of the net revenues go into our Affordable Housing Reserve Fund, and we use those funds to fund our capital planning. Inclusionary zoning, there's a team working on possible implementation of inclusionary zoning, which is focused on transit stations and requiring residential development there, either by private sector or not-for-profits, to deliver some units as affordable. The short-term rental bylaw limits for Airbnbs and that sort of things to ensure the supply of rental housing remains. You're probably, most of you are familiar with the new vacant unit tax to ensure that units aren't left vacant. And then we also work with our not-for-profit partners to obtain municipal capital facility agreements, which would give them tax exemptions and again, reduce rents, ensure greater affordability. Next slide, please. So how is funding allocated within the city? Talked about the funding envelopes we have access to, but how is it allocated? Staff present a report to council each year to our annual affordable housing capital strategy to seek council authority to allocate funds to specific projects or to issue requests for proposals and expressions of interest using the Action Ottawa guidelines, where sometimes we bundle them with land, city-owned land, fee waivers and that sort of incentive. But it's important to note that the city must submit an investment plan to upper levels of government for approval of the proposed spending allocations where the funds have come from the province or the federal government. They have guidelines on how the funds can be used. We enter into agreements and staff have to work within those guidelines to establish eligibility and selection criteria for the funding allocations. Next slide, please. So we will be presenting the next capital strategy report to Planning and Housing Committee on June 7th. And this time we're taking a different approach. That is, given the increasing costs of projects that are currently underway, we'll be presenting a term of council capital plan that considers 4 years of city funding that is contemplated in the LRFP, the Long Range Financial Plan, providing a total funding envelope of $74.6 million. So there are certainly successes to celebrate, though, and be proud of. So it sounds like it's all doom and gloom. We don't have enough money, but there are successes. To date, we've been successful in delivering nearly 2,500 affordable housing units in the city. Plus, there are an additional 1,518 units at various stages of construction that are either fully or partially funded. And of course, it's those partially funded projects that are causing these funding pressures that we're currently experiencing. But there are also opportunities for future construction with approximately 750 units in the pre-development stage. And many of those have received pre-development funding from the city. We issued RFPs for to offer pre-development funding to projects to get them through the planning approvals and prepare their projects for construction, get them into an investment ready stage. And next slide, please. So the next couple of slides are just to give you a flavor of some of the projects that are currently underway. This is the affordable housing portfolio, and there are 1,338 units currently underway. Only 128 of those are fully funded, so many of them require some amount of additional contingency budget to get them across the finish line to construction completion. And the next slide. These are our supportive housing units that are underway. So we have another 180 units that are underway that will provide supportive housing, and many of those, again, will require some additional funding. Most of what I've pointed out will be completed in the near term. So, 2024 completion. So we should see a lot of new units come online at that point. But what's not happening is sufficient funding to start new construction, since the cost has gone up significantly. So next slide, please. So the key takeaways: the Affordable Housing Capital Plan will need to take a term of council approach. So we'll look at the largest funding envelope we can as we try to bring as many projects as we can online. There are many new projects and initiatives underway, but funding is needed to ensure continued delivery of new affordable housing. Construction cost increases are causing funding shortfalls, and higher interest rates translate into greater equity needed to obtain financing, creating further pressures for capital funding. The city is advocating for better planning, collaboration between governments, and a need for matching and sustained annual funding for our capital planning purposes. There is a pipeline of pre-development and investment-ready affordable housing projects representing around 750 units and requiring more than 140 million in public funding. But these could be delivered within the next 5 years.
Lauren, can I just ask you to stop just for a second? Heather, we seem to be now watching Lynn Markel's screen, I think, or someone else's screen, and we've lost Lauren's slide. So before Lynn starts going to any sites that she doesn't want the rest of the group to see, or whatever's happening here. All right. Thank you so much. Okay.
Great. It's my last slide, though. Okay. So there is a pipeline of pre-development and investment-ready affordable housing projects representing at least 747 units and requiring more than 140 million in public funding, but these could be delivered within the next 5 years, subject to that funding being available. So in light of these new economic realities of construction cost and interest rate increases, the city is committed to revisiting the housing long-range financial plan. And this is anticipated to be complete prior to the 2024 city budget deliberations. So we'll see what that may bring. That's the end of my presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. I so appreciate the level of detail, and just to give participants a sense of what I had requested. For the purposes of today, we're not so much talking about housing benefits or homelessness, shelter programs, that aspect of housing along the continuum, just to give this particular focus to what it takes to build the thing, because you can see from Lauren's presentation, it is a complex world to navigate through. And if you can imagine the proponents that are coming through that are trying to get this funding, we have faith-based groups, we have, other kinds of, organizations that support persons with disabilities. We've got organizations that support people with mental health considerations. These organizations, their primary purpose is not necessarily to provide affordable housing, but they know that that is an essential component for their community to thrive. And so they are willing to take on that challenge with the support of the City of Ottawa, but they're not experts in this. So enter CAHDCO. CAHDCO is an affordable housing development consultant, nonprofit, might I add. Am I biased? Sure, of course I am. I used to work there, okay? So, if that's a conflict of interest, I don't know. We're not giving him any money for doing this, okay? He's just showing up, so don't worry about it. But He's the guy that takes all the information that Lauren just gave and goes, okay, let's make it work. And he will work with clients from, as I said, various backgrounds to make this work for their communities, for their beneficiaries. So it is an important part of the ecosystem. And, you know, when Lauren is talking about the affordable housing, the community improvement plan, I asked if Glenn Gower was on the call, but Glenn Gower, Councillor Gower, is the vice chair of the Planning and Housing Committee, and he was saying there might be an affordable housing community improvement plan coming forward in the next term of council, and that might look at how do we make it easier for people to develop affordable housing? How do we give them better tax exemptions on their property taxes or decrease their expenses in other ways? It might be consultants' fees. I don't know what it's going to be, but we're trying to make this easier. But right now, that's Graham's primary objective as well. So without further ado, Graham, I'll turn it over to you, and you can help give people an education on what your daily life looks like in affordable housing development.
Thanks. Yeah, not being paid, living the dream. Yeah, maybe just a quick commentary is, or suggestion is maybe the Accelerator Fund and the city's affordable housing CIP can be connected. Maybe the Accelerator Fund can help finance the initiatives that Lauren's team will promote in the CIP, which they're working on. So as Laine said, I help nonprofits and co-ops in Ottawa develop affordable housing, and this presentation content is really based on information and content that I've developed to help nonprofits across the country on how to develop affordable housing, but I think it should be relatable to the audience of residents and councillors and staff. So you can advance to the next slide. Start with a bit of a brief introduction. Laine's kind of referred to it as CAHDCO and CCOC. You can go to the next slide, but kind of talk a little bit about what we do, because it is unique. As far as I know, we're the only nonprofit real estate developer in the city of Ottawa. There's probably about maybe a dozen or more groups like CAHDCO across the country. We have the same roles and responsibilities as a for-profit developer, finding land, money, and hiring a team to build a real estate project, but what we're focused on is developing affordable rental housing and home ownership. And we, as a business model, are a not-for-profit. So that might be under our own banner of CAHDCO as affordable home ownership. It might be under the banner of our related corporation, Centertown Citizens Ottawa Corporation, which develops and operates affordable mixed rental housing, but we also provide those same kind of roles and responsibilities as a fee-for-service consultant to many nonprofits and co-ops and charities in Ottawa and Eastern Ontario. And I'll share a bit about what we share with them and some examples of some projects that we've worked on recently in Ottawa. Next slide. So CAHDCO, as Lauren said, a lot of what the city is doing is providing financial incentives for groups to create affordable housing. And from a missional perspective, and to be honest, from like a tax dollar perspective, it makes sense that it's going to be nonprofits and charities because that's their purpose, and they get certain, tax breaks for things like property tax or HST, which help them kind of financially make these projects work. There's about 60 nonprofits and co-ops in Ottawa that own and operate affordable housing. It's about 25,000 apartments or homes. Ottawa Community Housing owns about 60% of those, and there's about 50 plus other nonprofits, co-ops, and charities that own and operate the rest. CCOC is one of them. And I usually think of affordable housing often. A lot of people are like, what is affordable housing? Like, people use the term so often. We need more affordable housing. We need housing that's affordable. But what is affordable housing? People have a hard time kind of putting a pin on exactly what it is, because it means a lot of different things to different people. But usually the definition relates to the rent that a family is paying or a household, and if there's any demographic priority. So sometimes projects are of deeper affordability or target a specific population demographic, and other times they are kind of mixed, and that's the CCOC model. CCOC owns and operates over 50 properties and 1,700 homes in downtown Ottawa, and in each CCOC building, there is a mixture of household types from single people to families. There's a mixture of rents from modest market rent to deeper affordability, and a mixture of abilities. Some people need an affordable place to live, and they also need some supports to help them to live independently. Next slide. So these are a snapshot of many of the groups that CAHDCO is working with. Obviously, a group like Ottawa Community Housing is large and has a lot of capacity, but most of the other organizations in Ottawa that own and operate affordable housing are modest. They're not focused on development. They're focused on operating the housing or providing the supports and the services. And so we, in effect, were created to kind of help those groups with that complicated and risky piece. And we've worked on many different types of affordable housing projects, including with co-ops and charities, mixed income housing, supportive housing, shelters for women and children who are escaping violence. We've helped create housing specifically for seniors or youth and other specific population demographics. Next slide. So I know there was a few questions about this. What is affordable housing? So I'll try and, share with you how the government views this and a little bit of how the sector views it. But you as a resident or somebody who's in need of housing might have your own different perspective on it. As I said, there's no one kind of standard definition of what it is. Next slide. But CMHC probably has the most well-recognized infographic on how to explain it. This is called the CMHC Housing Continuum, and it's a linear representation of different types of housing. It's somewhat a representation of the tenuousness of tenure, but it's really not a perfect model because housing is complex. So on the left are people who are the most tenuous. They're homeless, living rough on the street possibly, and on the right you have those who are the most housing secure, people who own their own home. And the infographic kind of infers that there is this transition along a continuum from left to right. But as we know, a lot of people don't necessarily jump from one category to next. But when I think of affordable housing, I think of everything in that dashed blue box. But that is quite a range. That effectively means housing that is targeted in Ottawa at people who typically live at maybe about the 40th income percentile or lower. Again, that might not mean something to you, but we'll kind of explain it in an income perspective in a second. So people who live in emergency shelters and transitional housing often need extra supports. They're usually there for an interim amount of time, and then they move on to some type of permanent housing. Social housing is a bit of a dated term, but it's still commonly used. It typically refers to housing that was created quite a while ago that involves an ongoing rental subsidy, but as new affordable housing is created, it's not in that same model. So mostly when people are creating new affordable housing, typically what they're referring to is rental housing that is owned and operated by some type of nonprofit charity or co-op that offers housing to people of a limited income that usually come off of a waiting list. But what income they have and what rent they might be paying really might vary by project by project. And affordable home ownership is examples, or the most common example would be like a Habitat for Humanity. Next slide. So realistically, the housing continuum doesn't represent a linear path. Heather, can you advance the slides one?
Sorry.
That's okay. Some people won't move through some people will move through the continuum. Others may change housing types in different ways. So this is another CMHC infographic that they call the wheelhouse model, just to kind of shake it up to say that it's not so simple. They describe it in 3 categories of safety net, housing with supports, and market housing. So in essence, you could think of the various types of affordable housing as being the 4 pieces of the pie that start with an emergency shelter or under the safety net category and include the housing with supports category. I think what's interesting about this is in any one of these types of housing, you can have housing that is targeted at a specific demographic, or you could have housing that is just kind of for the general population. Usually when housing is created for a specific demographic, people refer to that as supportive housing. Next slide. So who lives in affordable housing? Really everybody. In CCOC's model of mixed housing, that could be anybody from one of these demographic categories living under one roof. With other affordable housing, some of the projects that Lauren put up on her screen earlier, it might be that a building is created for a specific demographic population. Why I put these demographic populations up on the screen is because these are the priority populations listed in the CMHC National Housing Strategy. So when groups are creating affordable housing, they typically are in Ottawa looking to get support from the City of Ottawa, but that won't pay for all the costs. They also have to get support from other levels of government and other sources like CMHC. And so when CMHC is looking at applications, they're looking to see, does it create housing for these particular demographic populations? Next slide. So you switch the two words and it becomes somewhat of a different concept. So affordable housing is really, that is a construct. It doesn't really mean anything specific. It's a catch-all term, but usually it's for housing that's created for people of limited and modest income, and it usually involves some type of government support. Housing affordability is a Statistics Canada definition that applies to all of us. You're considered housing insecure if you pay more than 30% of your gross household income on your housing expenses, such as mortgage or rent or other utilities. So in a typical affordable housing project, and sorry, just to say that we used to use this term, 30% of a household income often would get referred to a common affordable housing term called rent geared to income, or RGI. And again, like social housing, that's a little bit of a dated term. It still does exist, but most affordable housing isn't created in a rent geared to income fashion. Usually when groups are creating affordable housing, the projects that Lauren outlined, they're creating housing that is typically at these rent categories. And I'll quickly explain what they mean. This is for a one-bedroom apartment. It's a 2021 number, but that's partly because the data on these lags a year. So this is, just as a disclaimer, not a complete list, but meant to be kind of representative. So when groups are applying to the city or to CMHC, they are looking to create housing that is typically rented at the average market rent or less. What level of rent slightly depends on the group and also depends on how much support they'll get from the governments. If they're creating housing that has lower and lower or more affordable rents, they generally get more support from the government. And they need that because they're creating housing that is more affordable. So a lot of affordable housing is created at this what's called a below market level, which is approximately 80% of the average or median market rent. A lot of groups, when they say affordable housing, that's the level that they're creating it to. And groups that are often creating supportive housing are creating housing that's typically rented at the social service shelter rent. And if that's Ontario Works, that's $375 for a single person, or just under $500 for a single person on ODSP. So it used to be in affordable housing that the most affordable rents were called rent geared to income. And now in the newer projects built, the most affordable rents typically are those OW and ODSP rent levels. That's often supportive housing. And in your generic affordable housing, groups like CCOC and some of the other groups, you see rents like at this below market rent level, and for 2 or 3 bedroom apartments, obviously those numbers would be slightly higher. Next slide. So here's an example of a project that was recently finished. It's I tried to use a few examples that are slightly different in project type and group and type of housing. So this is a project created by Multi-Faith Housing. It was finished a couple of years ago. They used a piece of property that was owned by Canada Lands Company, which is an arm of the federal government, convinced them to sell it to them at below market so that they could create affordable housing, and got support from all 3 levels of government, city, feds, and the province to create this supportive housing for veterans who have been homeless or coming off the street. Next slide. You just see kind of a site plan of where the building lies and the amenities there. There's really an emphasis on like the design, because everybody here comes from that experience of living on the street, but also being in the military. And so people might be coming with severe mental illness and have supports, dogs and so forth. So kind of really interesting design to respond to a specific population demographic. Before this, MHI had created mostly affordable housing for families, but there was a study done about 5 to 10 years ago that demonstrated that a large amount of people living on the street in Ottawa were from a military background, and they were motivated to create a project specifically for that. Next slide. You can go to the next slide. So this is more about what you need to know about groups who are looking to create affordable housing. So really, where does a project start? It starts with identifying a need. That might come in different ways, like the MHI story. They identified a need for a specific population. The city, we have something called the Ottawa Social Housing Registry waitlist, which contains a wait list of people ongoing who are in need of affordable housing. So groups typically will do some type of needs assessment before they make a commitment to create a project to identify what is the need either in a specific area or for a specific population, and that helps them to develop a project specifically suited for that. Again, that might be a specific population, it might be mixed. Next slide. There are really three types. When you say somebody's doing an affordable housing project, there's really three types. There's somebody who's doing like a major retrofit or renovation of an existing site that they might already own. There's the acquisition where you buy an existing apartment building and maybe modify it or make it more affordable over time. And then there's where you have a piece of land that you've bought or own and you're building something new. Really, all of these are affordable housing. Ultimately, what we're looking to do is create the amount of, or increase the amount of units. Retrofit renovation gets you there faster, and same with acquisition, but you often don't create your kind of perfect project because you have to kind of work with what's there. It can be less expensive sometimes, but sometimes it can be more expensive because it comes with a lot of unknowns. And then new construction, really you can build your perfect project in some ways. It's new construction. It could be more energy efficient and accessible, help people age in place, make great communities, but at the same time, those are the things that take the longest because you have to buy the land, go through the planning process, and then build building from beginning to end. Next slide. So really any development project, affordable housing or not, needs these three basic components: the capital, the money that's going to pay for the land and all the expenses. You need the land where you're going to, acquire with the building or build a new building, and you need the capacity, the expertise, and the knowledge to both build the project and then to operate the project in the long term. And typically no group really has all of that. And groups who are creating affordable housing, the nonprofits and co-ops will, their capacity will kind of come from a combination of what they have and partnering or hiring other groups and consultants to complement what they have. We think of this as the three-legged stool. If you're missing any of these three components, your project doesn't stand up. You won't be able to move forward. So groups, when they're at the earliest stages, they're trying to understand whether they have these three components, and if so, then they'll make kind of like a go or no go decision as to whether they want to move forward. At this point, all the money that they're spending is basically at risk. Like a developer, they don't know if they're going to get the government support or not. Next slide. So this outlines many of the key groups that are involved in creating an affordable housing project and are kind of essential to the success. So some groups might play multiple roles. Other times they might just play one role and partner or hire for the rest. There's whoever owns the land. That could be a faith group. It could be government land. It could be the nonprofit. Maybe you're buying it. There's the housing provider, and each group sometimes identifies them slightly different. They might call themselves the nonprofit landlord, the housing provider, the community group. There's the project team, and when CAHDCO is working on a project, usually our role is to kind of lead the team and hire the architect and the builder. Think of us as the developer. There's who's going to operate the building once it's built, and sometimes that's the housing provider, but sometimes they'll outsource that and hire a property management company. There's various community partners who might assist in creating and operating or supporting a project. There's support services. Sometimes there's supportive housing, but then sometimes there's just affordable housing where people might need some supports, and that could come from a community resource center or a community health center or other groups like that, the Royal Ottawa. There's all the funders and lenders, and that might be 8 or 10 different groups that help contribute to the cost of a project. And then the regulators. So the, Lauren's group at the housing branch, but also the planning department and then the other government bodies. They're all really important allies for every project. And there's not just like the one group that goes off and creates the project. In essence, if it is a Ottawa community housing or a CCOC project, what they're doing is helping to work with all of these different groups to help bring the project forward. Next slide. So here's another example. This was of an acquisition retrofit, and I like to use this one because it was a really great partnership with a market developer. People often ask, what's the role of market developers? And I think there is a role, but I don't think it's fair to expect that they're going to give away profit for that purpose. But market developers are developing real estate all the time, and joint ventures are a part of real estate, and we're trying to develop affordable housing. And so where there is opportunities to work with market developers is where you're creating affordable housing and also serving their purpose of what they're trying to do at the same time. So in this case, Cornerstone Housing for Women bought this property. It was formerly owned by Catholic Sisterhood and used as a residence for Catholic sisters who were coming to Ottawa to study at one of the various universities and colleges. It was like a safe place to stay. It was like a dorm style building, and Cornerstone bought it with the support of the city and a few other sources and renovated it into permanent supportive housing for women who were formerly homeless. 42 apartments. You can go to the next slide. So in this project, Cornerstone is ultimately the landowner and the housing provider. They do the property management themselves. It's their staff that are, cleaning the not the apartments, but cleaning the building in general, maintaining it, taking the rents. And they actually have case managers and other social workers who provide supports to the tenants. So they do most of the roles that I had described earlier. And also, we don't need to go back, but if you were looking at the infographic of where the money comes from, you will notice that a couple $1 million came from Cornerstone themselves. That was money that they had to commit, fundraise, and contribute to the project that they're not ever going to get back in like a return on investment market development way. That was invested in the project to create the building, which helps create the affordable housing that will always be there forever. And the partnership was really neat because this site, there was a private developer who had the first right of refusal to buy this property from the sisters. But in their type of housing that they wanted to create, this existing building didn't make sense. And it also didn't make sense to buy the property and tear the existing building down because it was actually in good shape. So the best of a good world was that they bought the site from the sisters. They severed and sold the existing building to Cornerstone, who created the housing, and they did infill development around the rest of the site. I think they're still building that right now near Dovercourt Rec Center. And as part of this, as part of the financial transaction, the Catholic sisters sold the property at a below market price to the developer on condition that they would sever and sell and pass off that discount to Cornerstone. So in fact, Cornerstone bought the land at below market. The discount basically came from the Catholic Sisterhood, but it was enabled through the partnership with the private developer. Next slide. So these are the various kind of 4 stages that any real estate project needs to go through to create, whether it's affordable housing or market development. There's an initial kind of analysis and feasibility stage, and usually at the end of that, people will make that go or no go decision. Whether it's affordable housing or market housing, there's still that kind of analysis and business case decision, and that might take months or years. That really depends on a whole number of factors, the group, but also, as Lauren was saying, as we've had inflation and rising interest rates, the existing projects supported by the city need more funding, which means the next projects are going to have to wait a little bit longer. So they're kind of in effect somewhat waiting at kind of probably the transition of this first to second stage. They can't make a decision to fully go ahead until they know they're going to get the support from the city. Not all the money comes from the city, but the city is kind of a little bit like the lead domino, as I like to explain it. But they've done an analysis to kind of know that the project makes sense, and they're kind of waiting there. And once they get that indication that they'll be able to get financial support, they'll quickly go through and finalize their design and prepare the project to begin construction. And then projects will operate for decades. So often when a group approaches CAHDCO, we will be involved in the project for somewhere between 7 and 10 years. And typically the project will not begin construction for 3 to 5 years after the group initially contacts us and starts working with us. So it's a really long process. Next slide. So kind of flipping over, often people want to know about the money and they think of it like a black box. They know that there's some complexity there, but they just don't quite understand it. And what I want to say is, and the same with market development. And I think, you know, to be honest, market developers probably sometimes get a benefit of the doubt that they don't deserve, because we don't quite understand how do they do what they do. But what they do is not that complicated, but it doesn't mean that there's a lot of people doing it that are successful. So really, to create affordable housing, it's a balance. It's dependent on balancing these 3 factors. The affordable housing nonprofits and co-ops aren't going to create the housing unless it achieves their mission. And usually that relates to the level of rent that the tenants are paying, or the level of affordability, and the demographics. So with CCOC, they're not going to create a CCOC affordable housing project unless it kind of meets that mixed income affordable housing model. And Cornerstone Housing for Women isn't going to create a project unless it's, you know, meets a certain level of affordability and it's targeted towards the people that they want to house. But every affordable housing project in the country, doesn't matter the type, demographic, or level of affordability, needs some form of government support. And usually the projects that are successful often are getting all 3 levels of support. And so the government has a limited amount of money to spend on affordable housing, as Lauren was saying. So in effect, there's a lot more projects out there than the government can financially afford to support. And these groups are all competing against each other, which is in some ways good for the taxpayer. It means you're getting a competition, and you know, the idea is that the projects that Lauren's team support are effectively the projects, through their analysis, that are the best investment for the limited amount of money that the government has. And usually they're choosing projects that, if you kind of compare an apples to apples, they're trying to create the most amount of affordable units at the greatest level of affordability for the demographic groups that are the greatest in need. That is not such a computer model. There's a lot of soft side to that, but it's kind of the simple part of it. And so groups who are looking to create affordable housing need to think about, like, what are the considerations that are important for the government, and how do we kind of maximize our competitiveness to get the government funding? And so that, in addition to just creating the affordable housing, is creating housing that's deeply energy efficient, thinking about the climate change future, and is accessible or visitable to the aging population. So that's kind of very typical of an affordable housing project. Is usually it tends to be rental housing. It tends to be more energy efficient than the typical market housing, and usually more accessible, because those are the requirements of the government. But particularly now, we can't ignore that there's all the market conditions of how much the land costs, and inflation and rising interest rates, and market conditions are even more important to the nonprofit groups, because the government has a limited amount of money. So we as the nonprofits are the ones who have to figure out how to take the limited amount of money from all the different parts and piece it together to pay for the costs. So they're often thinking about, how do we optimize a project to meet the government needs, but also to be kind of cost efficient. Next slide. So just a couple more slides. So to determine if a project is financially viable or not is really a continuous process. There's often no one exact place to start. You kind of start wherever you are. Some groups have land and they want to create affordable housing. Some groups have been endowed some money and they're looking at how to use that best. Other groups, like multi-faith housing, were motivated to create housing for a particular demographic. They didn't have the land, they didn't have the money, so they were kind of starting with that. We at CAHDCO typically start by understanding that the housing provider's mission statement, what it's looking to achieve. If they already own land, we'll look at the site that they have and what the rules and regulations are. And with that simple analysis, architects and planners can help you create basically like a Lego block. They call it a massing of what you're allowed to build that kind of meets the client's mission or expectations, and we apply some basic assumptions to figure out how much it's going to cost to build the building and to anticipate how much it will cost to operate it in the future, which is important because you need to get mortgage financing, so the operating budget's a big part of that. At that point, you then try to identify what are the various sources that will pay for all the capital costs and the revenues to pay for the operating expenses. And in my experience, both on the market side and the nonprofit side, it's not simple. Like, there's very few market developers who have financial success. We sometimes hear about the wealthy developers, but they in essence are very limited. There's a lot of developers who don't have success, and affordable housing is also very difficult. If it wasn't so difficult, then maybe we wouldn't have such a housing crisis. So at this moment, when every group kind of goes and initiates this process and creates their first budgets that the developers will call a pro forma, the sources never equal the expenses. There's always what you can call like a gap of funding, or groups call it an equity gap. And essentially you need to go back and revisit what are your priorities and what are your assumptions that go into the concept, readjust your costing assumptions and your revenue sources. And if the gap gets smaller, then you're heading in the right direction. And if the gap is getting larger, you're kind of heading in the wrong direction. And every time we kind of go around the circle, you can, like, developers just use Microsoft Excel to create their financial models, and you can simply change the name of the file every time. At the end of a project, an affordable housing group will have more than 100 versions of their budget, and probably more than 75 will be in that first phase. There's really, just like a market developer, an optimization of the financials of a project before anybody in the public ever hears about it. We've been working on projects that have are really far along, that aren't in Lauren's slides, that have been working at this for sometimes years and like trying to optimize it to kind of move it forward. So before anybody ever hears, even Lauren sometimes or the councillors hear about potential projects, the groups are doing like this deep analysis and trying to optimize things to create affordable housing and meet the government requirements and pay for all of the expenses at the same time. Next slide. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's the capital and the operating side. So just to say that on the cost side, the costs are very similar to market development. There's the cost of land, the cost for all the consultants and the city fees. There's the hard cost to pay the people and the materials to build the building. Where it slightly differs, really the only difference between market housing development and affordable housing is where does the money come from? In market housing, they like to use this term, the capital stack, and that's the stack is the various sources of funding that will help pay for the project. It's never, it doesn't all come from the bank. It usually comes from a combination of banks and investors. And in affordable housing, these are the typical sources. But most of the projects, except for a rapid housing initiative project, will get anywhere from maybe 6 to 10 different sources of funding to pay for their project. I heard a nonprofit recently refer to it as the lasagna because it's very soft and involves, sometimes layering the same ingredients over again. So sometimes groups will apply to a few different city programs and get funding. And sometimes groups will apply to a few different CMHC programs and other programs. And at the end of the day, in our experience, save and except for a rare exception, groups that are creating affordable housing don't get all the money from the government. As Lauren said, except for rapid housing, most projects are maybe getting 30 to 50% from the government, and the other remaining money is coming from a combination of mortgage financing that they have to pay back. It might come from CMHC, but it's still mortgage financing or a bank, and then equity that they contribute themselves. Next slide. So here's a bit more detail on where some of those sources are, but I just want to hone in on the equity part. many of the projects that we've worked on, the examples that I've provided, those groups have provided anywhere from 20 to 50% of the total project costs from their own sources. And sometimes if a group has been around for quite a while, like CCOC, maybe they've saved some money over time because they're not for profit, so they kind of save it away and they can use that as equity, or maybe another property is free of mortgage and they can leverage that. Other charities like Multi-Faith Housing or Cornerstone would fundraise and do philanthropic campaigns. And sometimes groups are providing the land, and that has a value to it as well. But the basic equation on how do you create the affordability in affordable housing is the more government investment, the greater the level of affordability. So, you know, I think we all appreciate that the government has a limited amount of money and inflation is and interest rates, even though the government tries to tinker with the Bank of Canada, like it is a little bit out of their hands. And so it's really challenging right now. But the projects that get a greater investment from the government need less mortgage financing, and that allows them to operate with less rental revenue at the end of the day. That's kind of the simple equation. Next slide. 2 more slides here. So here's a few. Groups can't just charge more money and more rent or sell it for more, because that's against their mission. So they're often looking at the cost side, both capital and operating expenses, and trying to optimize and reduce those. So this is fairly common for a lot of groups. Like most groups will be looking to leverage land from the government, or maybe it's a faith property, maybe it's land that they already own. If a nonprofit has to go out and buy land at a market price, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to create affordable housing. Most of the groups are nonprofit and charities, in part because that's their mission, but they also get quite a large rebate on HST, which actually saves about 10% of the total project costs. They're getting like 80% reduction on their HST expenses, so 80% on 13%, 10% of your total expenses. And many of the groups, all of the charities and the supportive housing groups, don't have to pay property taxes. So for the groups that are creating deep levels of affordability, for those that are on social assistance, that really helps a lot. But the city, not as of right, but for the most part, waives city fees and development charges for affordable housing in Ottawa. A lot of groups will think about how do we optimize the design and the building technologies, kind of balancing paying more for an energy efficient building, but saving on the operating expenses. And some groups who don't have land to do a building will be thinking about, should I buy an existing building or should I buy land to build a new building? Like what will get me the approval from the government and kind of get the biggest bang for my buck. Next slide. So here's just one last example of a project. On the left, you'll notice that there's kind of 2 halves to the building. On the left is a white brick veneer. That was originally built over 50 years ago. It was the first affordable housing building created in Ottawa, specifically for seniors, owned by a group called the King's Daughters and Sons. This is in the Glebe in Dow's Lake. They had a big piece of land and it allowed them to build a full height addition to the site, effectively doubling the amount of units that are affordable for seniors, and it allowed them in the new building to have a whole floor at the bottom that's amenity spaces for all of the seniors. In the new and existing building, they only had one original elevator. They put in an elevator in the addition, so now there's a lot more accessibility and more services that can come in there to support the seniors to age in place because they have more amenity spaces to serve them. But what made this financially successful, or allowed the King's Daughters and Sons to do this, was that they had paid off the original financing mortgage that helped create the original building. They had the same rent revenues, but had less expenses because there was no mortgage. And they used that, the bank calls that the net operating income, or the nonprofits would call it their surplus, use their surplus from their existing units to allow them to get a greater mortgage to help to contribute to the costs of the addition, in addition to getting support from the city and CMHC. And that allowed them to build the new building. Next slide. You can see some interior shots there of the lobby and kind of the floor plate. And in the back, there's some gardens that were designed for people who are in wheelchairs and physically accessible. Next slide. So kind of the takeaways from the nonprofit side of it is really that every project needs those 3 legs of the stool. It needs the money, to pay for all the expenses. It needs the land where the project's going to be located, and it needs the capacity. But really where groups start is like with the capacity. Sometimes they don't have the land. Sometimes they haven't gotten the funding or the financing yet. The capacity is kind of the key to unlock the other pieces. Even if you have land and some money, it doesn't guarantee success in a very risky business of development. And every project that's created effectively, and I'm going to say caveat, except for those supported by Rapid Housing Initiative, every single project needs government grants, they need mortgage financing, and they need money contributed by the nonprofit group. And usually what we're doing is coaching the groups that you're not trying to maximize one and minimize the other. You're actually trying to maximize all three of those. Like in this time where you have inflation, it's important to maximize the government you support you can get from all three levels of government, and to maximize the mortgage financing you can get, as well as the equity that they can contribute. That is it.
Wow. So let's give a big round of applause to our two presenters and thank them both for talking to us like we're grown-ups. That was a lot of information. I hope everyone knows there is a quiz now. No, but I mean, joking aside, I do really appreciate both of you guys coming in and offering such a detailed understanding of what it takes to build affordable housing. And if you don't know my background, I used to run a nonprofit that focused on civic education for the city of Ottawa. And, you know, sometimes after 6 weeks of an immersive learning experience, people would walk out and say, you know, all I really learned over the course of 6 weeks is that this was a lot more complicated than I thought it was. And maybe I can walk around with a little bit more empathy for those who are trying to get things done in a system that often really does require a lot of persistence, a lot of focus, and, you know, in an increasingly complex environment where, you know, you do have all of these competing pressures and priorities. It can get really tough, you know, for people to be able to go the distance. I mean, to understand that some of these projects have been at it for 7 to 10 years before we even see it. I mean, that is a real eye opener, I think, for me as a councillor, certainly, and for others on the call, I'm sure, to understand that this is a long game. But if I can offer, just before we go to questions, Heather, you know, when I went around to all of my council colleagues at the beginning of the term and did my little kiss the ring tour and hey, how are yous? Every single councillor, I mean, I swear, almost every single councillor said affordable housing is a priority. I mean, there was deep consensus. Now, how we get there is where we start creating the maybe the frictions. And we are undergoing our strategic planning process starting this week. And so that is when councillors will get an opportunity to put their cards on the table. But I assure you, you know, certainly for Ward 8, knowing that purpose-built rental housing is a way for us to support our Algonquin students in a better way, to support our seniors who are aging in place in homes that they want to downsize, they want to build community. Those two populations specifically right now are not being served by the market in the way that they need to be. And I think purpose-built rental housing and nonprofit housing investments are one way to support those two communities. So I just want to thank both our presenters again. And Heather, if I can offer, you know, I think we've got another 10 minutes here for questions. Did you want to try and synthesize a couple questions for our presenters?
Yeah, we had two main questions. I think both presenters did a really good job answering them as they came in. So the two that are left is how does co-op housing fit into this? And then the other one I'm going to bundle a little bit. So what percentage of new housing is family sized or accessible and age friendly? And those, you know, we have people working on different aspects of that. That's their focus. But, you know, if buildings are built for one, they tend to cover off the other. So if I'll let you guys choose who wants to speak to that. But those are, I think, are the two main questions out of this.
I don't mind starting, Lauren. On the co-op side, there is quite a few housing co-ops in the city of Ottawa that have existed for quite a long time, and some of them are considering redeveloping or building more co-op housing. The government in general at the local, province of Ontario and federal level don't really differentiate between the ownership in their programs. And in fact, market developers can respond to most of the CMHC programs and a lot of the City of Ottawa programs if they were able to create something that was more affordable and better value for money to the city. But just my own bias is when they run the program, it's typically in Ottawa, mostly nonprofits and charities. In other cities, like Vancouver and Toronto, where land is much more expensive, those same procurement processes often lead to housing developed by market developers in partnership with nonprofits. But in Ottawa, it's typically nonprofit exclusive. Land isn't as expensive, and we have some really strong groups. So there's no specific program necessarily that's like the co-op development program. There used to be previously, quite a while ago, like 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, there was specific programs to help create co-ops. Some of the money in the National Housing Strategy has been designated to create co-op housing. But what that means is it's almost like its own priority population. Like if you are a co-op and you apply to a CMHC program, you might be prioritized with their limited money, but it's not a specific program for co-ops. And in my experience, co-ops, it's harder to develop co-op housing without a specific program, because as you just learned, it takes a long time and is really risky, and co-ops tend to not have the resources to kind of withstand those risks without a specific program. And then I lost track of the other question, which was about like accessible and
accessible, age-friendly, and family housing.
Yeah. So again, Lauren, maybe you want to add to this, but with the CMHC programs and with the city programs, when they tend to give out their money, they do it through a competitive like procurement process. And they have a number of criteria in those procurements in addition to just affordability. And that includes definitely energy efficiency, accessibility, and things like, a priority on family housing and sometimes housing for particular demographics. And the same with the CMHC programs. So usually groups that are creating affordable housing are trying to, in the most efficient way, kind of achieve a whole bunch of different things at the same time. But I guess I would also just say that we have a waiting list of more than 12,000 households. And so we, in Ottawa, and this is the same for most cities and small towns across the country, need more housing, affordable housing for all different populations. And in Ottawa, that is a lot of families and a lot of single households. And a particular growing need for refugee housing for new Canadians and refugees.
I don't think I have a whole lot to add, only that there is a minimum accessibility requirement at 10%. And as Graham was alluding to, you score points for how well you meet these requirements in our competitive process. So you're encouraged to exceed that. CMHC's programs have typically asked for 15% accessible units. So that's certainly being achieved. Family size units, we're always looking for more of those and encourage our housing partners to provide larger units, 2, 3, 4 bedroom units where possible. And seniors developments, one of the more recent, I think it was just last year, we approved, or council approved Wigwamen development. It's an Indigenous seniors development, 50 units in the east end of the city. So it's not fully funded yet, but they have land from the city, and we allocated $5 million for them to get started on that, specifically for Indigenous seniors.
Yeah, so if I can just sort of add to this, when we're thinking about family-sized units or even those amenity spaces that Graham was referring to, affordable housing development is under the same financial pressures as for market housing development. You don't recover revenue from an amenity space, a public amenity space, in the same way that you do a rentable square footage, right? And so those are the trade-offs that groups are having to make, is when they're looking to put together their pro forma, they have to think, okay, what is my recoverable revenue from this design? And often you will see amenity spaces in maybe the first, laundry list of nice to haves. And that will be eliminated because it ends up being, a quick and dirty that way. Similarly, bringing buildings up to a certain level of accessibility. There's been a lot of conversation lately about elevators and persons with mobility challenges, being caught in weather events and other types of things, right? If you have 2 elevators in a building versus 1 elevator, then you're starting to make decisions on how your floor plan is changing, where those accessible units are. CCOC has talked about, back when I used to work for them 2 years ago, putting accessible units on the first floor so that you don't get yourself in a situation where someone has to use an elevator in a moment of evacuation. But all of these create financial pressures on a proposed development. And so although we want to have all of the same quality of life benefits in affordable housing, those are the choices sometimes that groups are forced to make in order to get the thing built. And it's a toughie. It's a toughie, but it's a reality. So I think there was Heather, was there one more question before we close off tonight?
There is a few more questions. One is about, how much money it would take for CAHDCO to build a project like the seat you're build today. And then sweet spots about affordable housing sizes. So, my suggestion is that we keep, we can answer this a little bit, but we can keep this conversation going. Because there's a lot of people that have requested the slides and a copy of the recording. So we can capture any answers or questions that we haven't answered and try to put that out all together. But if you want to speak to, I think, sort of the costs.
Yeah. If you could maybe just speak in general terms, Graham, because I don't want this to be like CAHDCO's pitching their services on our presentation moment. I think that would sort of get into the realm of inappropriateness, but maybe you can talk about why what advantages. You're a nonprofit yourself, right? So like, what does that look like when it comes to people working with you?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer the question. We are a consultant that gets paid out of the project expenses, but typically groups approach us almost like a proof of concept. They're looking for us to help them identify how to get money to pay for our expenses and all the other expenses of the project. So usually when a group approaches us, there'll be a very nuanced conversation that might last months before they ever hire us. Because again, they're going to work on a project that's going to be 5 or more years and might cost millions of dollars. So there's often this getting to know you phase of, can we help you? And does it kind of work well together? And then often we're helping the group maybe apply to one of the City of Ottawa's programs they call pre-development funding, or PDF, or CMHC has a program called SEED. And out of that, then they'll have some money to kind of pay us to help them do that initial feasibility. So it's usually kind of like a proof of concept. And then it might cost groups a couple % of the total project expenses at the end of the day for our fees. Usually groups, like just from a simple level, will spend about 15% of their total project costs on what they call the soft costs. That's fees and consultants and things like that. And so that's like the architect and CAHDCO and whatever. So we're kind of a part of that puzzle. And the other question that people were asking was about like kind of a sweet spot in affordable housing. And I would say there's no real sweet spot, like it kind of depends on so many different factors, but because the government only has a limited amount of money, in Ottawa, you kind of tend to see right now basically two scales of project. You have Ottawa Community Housing doing quite a lot, some larger developments because they've got large pieces of land, and some of them are redevelopments, some of them are land they bought. So we're talking about like mid-rise and high-rise buildings that might have 100 units in a building. But a lot of the groups that we work with tend to somewhere be in that range of about 25 to 50 units in an apartment building, and that's because these groups only have so much money. The sites are only so big that they can afford, and to be honest, the city of Ottawa only has so much money, so you're kind of trying to the juggling ball, trying to balance out those three things. Some projects that are bigger, they might have to phase them and do multiple buildings.
So Lauren, I'll just leave you with the last word. If there's anything else you'd like to add or.
No, I don't think so. I think
Okay.
Graham answered the question well. I was gonna say 40 is about the sweet spot, but that is in the middle. So supportive housing tends to target around, 40 is about the maximum for a supportive housing development, but we are seeing, slightly smaller as you were saying, Graham. Yeah.
Okay, well,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you again so much to the two of you, and to what a nice size group we had tonight. I think we had close to, we had over 40 participants today, and I know there's at least one or two other competing events happening tonight. So I'm just so pleased to welcome you, and we will do our best to with permission of the presenters, we'll figure out what we can send out to guests, and you'll see this presentation up on our YouTube channel. And if there's any follow-ups, with any other public meetings or information sessions, I really do, a more informed, engaged participation from our residents leads to a better city for everyone. So please don't hesitate to reach out to my office regardless of where you live. And again, just my deep gratitude to everyone for your energy and trying to build a better city for everybody. Thank you very much. Have a great night.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.